Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think at this point, good morning and good afternoon to those on different time zones. It's morning for me. I'm based in Colorado. Welcome everyone to the next FFT Fostering Families Today webinar. We're doing a wonderful panel on Kinship Voices today. So just a little intro about that panel and how we're doing it. So with little notice of preparation, kinship caregivers step up to care for family or close friends. And so today we're going to hear what kinship parenting looks like from caregivers across the country and the resources that have helped them along the way this National Kinship Care Month. I'm your host, Nancy Marie Spears, Indigenous Children and Families reporter with The Imprint and enrolled member of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I am joined by my three esteemed guests today. We have Robin Wind Tiger, the GRAND Grand Voice Support Coordinator for Generations United. She is based on the Muskogee Nation Reservation in Oklahoma. We also have Jeannie Delaplane, who is the Kinship Care and Guardianship Program Manager for Child Welfare Programs and Practice at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families at Washington State. Last and certainly not least, we also have Rosalind Albert, who is the Kinship and Lifespan Respite Program Manager, Home and Community Services. She also focuses on aging and long-term support administration at the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. Welcome, ladies. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, and good afternoon for those on other parts of the country. So we're going to start today with just a little introduction about Fostering Families Today generally, which is the magazine that is hosting this webinar. So Fostering Families Today is a comprehensive foster care magazine offering resources, expert opinions, practical advice, and information on the latest evidence-based best practices for supporting children and youth who come from traumatic backgrounds. Published by nonprofit journalism organization Fostering Media Connections, the Fostering Families Today magazine is printed every other month and shipped directly to the homes and inboxes of foster care families and resource families across the country. Our foster parenting magazine was created for all families navigating the complexities of the foster care system, whether they are kinship caregivers or adoptive parents. It has been in print for nearly 2 decades, and as you see there, has won numerous awards. And there's our social media handles for Facebook or Twitter, or I'm sorry, the platform X, now known as Twitter. And our Instagram is there too for anyone who wants to join that. So we're actually going to start today off with a poll for everyone. You're just going to rate yourself from a number from 1 to 6 on how you feel your role is best defined in the kinship community. So we have 1, formal kinship caregiver, 2, informal kinship caregiver, 3, social worker or case manager, 4, current or former youth in kinship care, 5, a foster parent learning more about kinship care, and then the 6th option is other, and you just have an option to write in whatever you feel best defines you. So I'm going to mute myself for a minute and give you guys a few seconds to do that. So for anyone who needs me to repeat those options just generally, the poll question is, what role do you play in the kinship community? 1, a formal kinship caregiver, 2, an informal kinship caregiver, 3, a social worker or case manager, 4, a current or former youth in kinship care, 5, a foster parent learning more about kinship care, and 6, other. Okay, has everyone done the poll now? I think we are maybe ready to move on at this point. I see all the wonderful identifications in the chat there. Thank you to everyone who is being engaged with the chat. I really appreciate that. It gives me an opportunity to learn more about everyone in the room today. So thank you. All right, so looks like a lot of us in the kinship care in this poll, as far as the majority of us seem to be social workers and case managers. There's 54% of folks in the room fall into that category, and then a little bit throughout the rest of the categories. So good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for participating in our fun little poll to get us started today. So I think we're going to start with the questions first. So I think if no one has any questions about anything before we get started, I can go ahead and launch into the questions. Think we're missing a few of our little slides here, but I can go ahead and give you guys the rundown of this slide here, which is basically, we'll hear more about this at the end of our conversation, but at the end we have a list of caregivers resources for various types of families who may be involved with kinship care. And so we'll have a list of links at the end for everyone to engage with as they see fit. But without any further ado, I think I'm just going to go straight into questions if our esteemed panelists do not have any objections there. Okay. So the first question is pretty broad, but I think it's a good place to start. So just generally, I would like for each of you to walk me through the circumstances of what the process of becoming a kinship caregiver typically looks like. I know that unlike foster parenting, they're not going through months of training before a child enters their care. So what is that experience like? I will start with tossing it to Rosalind, and then Jeannie and Robin, you can answer next.
So just a little background, I work primarily with families that are outside the formal child welfare system. It might be that oftentimes the caregivers are kind of circumventing that whole system because they become involved with caring for the children before there's ever a need to get involved with the formal system. So oftentimes a typical scenario would be a child, a parent is taking the kiddo over to grandma's house to babysit for some reason. They need to go do an errand or whatnot, and then they don't come back. So the caregiver is totally unprepared, as you were saying earlier. They don't have any resources. They don't have any, they haven't taken any classes to learn more about, the special needs of the child in their home. They don't have an extra bed. They don't have clothes. They need to get them hooked up with school and all those types of things. So it's a lot more complex because they have, all instantaneously, they need to get resources and supports. So that might be for an informal family, and in the formal situations, it's a little bit different. So I'll pass that on to the cohorts to continue on in that whole process.
So I'm from DCYF, Department of Children, Youth and Family, and so we're the child welfare agency for our state. And so kinship families that are formed through us, it's usually rushed, it's rapid, it's case by case. Everyone is a little different. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit of planning that goes involved into becoming a kinship caregiver, but most of the time it's with little warning and little preparation. And it's stressful, it's overwhelming, it's confusing, the system is complex. Often caregivers don't know what they need and aren't even sure what words to use to ask for what they need. And so but we in Washington, we're working really hard to make some changes to make it a little bit easier for our caregivers, and we'll talk more about that as we go on.
So I came at this from in a different way. I was working in tribal foster care whenever I received placement of my grandson, and the day before he turned 4 months old, and I had 12 hours. And not only was it the shock of like, okay, so I have this injured child, this baby that I haven't had a baby in my home in 20 years. Now I've got 12 hours to come up with diapers, a car seat, a crib. And I was a caseworker, so I didn't have much money, right? So there was that shock, but in addition to, there's also the shock that you're in this position now, and for some reason your child has gotten their child into this position. So it was very lonely at the time. And since I did have connections, you know, with child welfare, Indian child welfare, that I'd had for years and years, I knew where to go for those answers and any help I might need, but it was still hard to get it. So that was my experience in a really short, quick nutshell.
Thank you for speaking to the vulnerability of that situation, because you know, it kind of is a great segue into our next question, which specifically focuses on what kind of resources and training are available to kinship caregivers. And this is especially, I think, in need of discussion because of that loss that you mentioned, right, Robin? There's the loss that you're dealing with from the loss of a functioning or independent birth parent. You know, maybe this is your child that you're now dealing with, who is, maybe they've passed away or they're incarcerated or disappeared. And now you're dealing with that. And you're also dealing with the loss of a healthy grandchild. Maybe in that case, if you're dealing with a child that does have multiple complex needs. And so I really appreciate you speaking to that in particular. And so with that in mind for our panelists here, what does resources and training look like for kinship caregivers? I'll start with Jeannie, and then we can go to Rosalind and Robin again.
So the types of resources that are available, there's actually quite a few. I just want to say our legislature and leadership at the highest level in Washington is very pro kinship. And so we have had a lot of initiatives over the last couple of years that have created more and more opportunities for resources and training for kinship caregivers. So just some of them. When a kinship caregiver is created, and we consider them an unlicensed caregiver, you know, like we have said, many of these caregivers, they unexpectedly are opening up their homes to children who can't remain in their own home. And so one of the first things we try to do is alleviate some of the financial strain of having a new child join the home, because it's expensive to raise children and adding another child into your home. And so in the state of Washington, there wasn't a way to get money quickly into the home other than the TANF grant. And so recently, like July 1st, we launched what we call the initial license. I like to think of the initial license as kind of like a driver's permit to the actual full, what we call a kinship license in our state. And what that means is it's very minimal, the requirements for it. It's basically passing a background check and passing the walkthrough of your home and being able to meet the child's basic needs. You're offered the initial license and you can start receiving foster care maintenance pretty quickly. We also, whenever a child is placed into a home with a kinship caregiver, we have a program called CARES, and it's capital C, little a, capital RES program. And this is a peer-to-peer support program. And these folks are outside of the agency, because many of our caregivers have told us it makes them nervous when caseworkers call them and check on them and stuff like that. So we set up this peer-to-peer support, and they call kinship placements within the first 4 days of placement to see, you know, what are your immediate needs? What do you need? Can we direct you here? Can we go? Because what we've learned is it's not often the lack of resources in the community, it's getting connected to those resources. And that's what the CARES program does. We also have a kinship license, which has a lot less requirements than a foster care license. And so those are just some of the few resources that we have. And we also work closely with our Kinship Navigator program.
Great segue. So the Kinship Navigator program is available to all these counties in Washington state. The Kinship Navigators can help coordinate resources, help get caregivers to support groups and to trainings that are available in the community. Many of the navigators also put on support groups that have a component of trainings available. There are some web-based support groups and trainings also available. We put on through the agency where I work, Aging and Long-Term Support Administration, we have a training that we put on twice a year for kinship caregivers and kinship navigators about oftentimes grief and loss and, many of the other issues that have, come up already in our conversation. So those are available to caregivers regardless of whether they're formal or informal. So we're really pleased to be able to bridge those gaps as well, because as we know, many families it's just a spectrum. They might start out in the formal system and then be informal, or vice versa, or they might have one child in the system, one child outside the system. So we're really trying to bridge those gaps and make sure that the whole family is being served.
I just want to say that Washington State is on the ball. While my little guy was in state custody, I'm fortunate that we are tribal citizens. So I was able to get some access to some help, not a whole lot because he wasn't in tribal custody, but the tribe was able to help. But it does differ between states and jurisdictions and tribes as to what everybody's going to be able to receive and how they're going to be able to receive that. Even the information on where to go to get, services or help. And for me, I really needed the peer-to-peer, which I didn't get until I joined the Grand Voices, a few years later. So that's an important component that Washington State is ahead of the curve on.
Can I mention real quickly that we also have a tribal navigator program that's a part of the broader Kinship Navigator program. So we have 7 tribes currently that are participating in that program because we recognize too that each nation is different, each pot of resources is different, each infrastructure is different. So we need to be able to have them fulfill their needs as best as possible and do a lot of partnerships along with them and provide resources as we can to help support.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points. And I do appreciate that we're talking about the multi-layered effects of dealing with different systems, whether it's a state system or a tribal system. I think it's important for all of our attendees and anyone that's listening to this to understand that there are differences and there are a separate set of challenges that each of these folks face when they're in those different systems. So I appreciate everyone speaking to that. And that's once again, great segue. We're all doing great with our flow of conversation today. Everything's been a great segue into the next thing. So my next question for all of you is specifically about the challenges of kinship care. I was wondering if you could all speak to kind of the challenges that you believe kinship caregivers face and how to deal with them. I think I'll start with you, Robin, because you kind of were a great segue into your challenges personally. So if you, I'll start with you and then we can go to Jeannie and Rosalind.
Sure. Well, I think that something that's not often spoken about is that, a lot of time kinship caregivers have challenges with their mental health because it is it's taxing. I mean, with my little guy, he's only slept about 2 hours a night for years. So and there wasn't really a whole lot of people who could help me with that. In addition to, people, my friends my age, their kids were grown. And really who wanted to hang out with somebody with a screaming baby, so it was kind of really isolating. So there's that, but there's also the financial challenges. I mean, I am a relatively young grandmother, and so I was working full time, but I did use all of my 401k and my savings, as far as legal services for my own self to try to make sure that he would remain in a safe space until his parents could get to where they needed to be. So there's that. There's if your child is not involved in the child welfare system, in a lot of places, there's a lot less resources that you can access, and that's just the truth right now. And I know we're all working to change that.
So in Washington, we really strongly believe in what we refer to as the co-design model when we do anything. And we have had so many research projects lately over at least the last 5 years involving kinship caregivers and listening to their lived experience. And so when I say to you, these are the challenges that the caregivers have said are their challenges: connecting to services, financial difficulties, struggling in their new role within their own family, the complexities of those family dynamics while sitting in meetings about hearing about your child and maybe their drug problem, while you're still in your heart, this is your child, and those difficulties are real. Respite. All of a sudden you have a child in your home and you need just I had one caregiver say to me, I just need 2 hours so I can go get my nails done, is what she wanted. And legal assistance is also a challenge. Now, I will say in our state, our legislature funded a program where we have a legal kinship advocate for the entire state. And her role is not to serve caregivers. Her role is to put together resources for caregivers. And so we have active lists of low and pro bono attorneys in each region that people can access. But we also have what's just coming up on a year of serving families, LARC, legal assistance referral for kinship caregivers. There's a lot of letters in that. But the bottom line is it's a legal hotline for caregivers. So if they have a legal question, they can access an actual attorney that can help them process stuff and come and move forward for answers. So we have those are the ones that I think about. So Rose, what about you in the informal world?
Well, you both really hit it. I can't add a whole lot on other than, the behavioral health needs of the caregivers and the kids. They've been through a lot. There's a reason they're living with a relative other than their birth parents, right? And so, the kinship caregiver is struggling with their feelings about how those circumstances came about. They're worried about the parent or parents of the kiddos because they still have a relationship with them. It's not like, they're part of the family. And then also, the tangible goods that we talked about earlier, the beds, the clothing, just a car seat, a crib, all of those things, and trying to get those in a short time frame, as Robin was talking about. I mean, you made it was helpful. It was so good to hear your personal side of things rather than, we talk to people, but I'm not a kinship caregiver. You're living that. So I really appreciate your insight and your experiences that you're sharing. But I can't think of anything else. You've already captured so much of what those concerns are that people have shared with us.
Nancy, could I just mention, I know we mentioned respite, but some of us, with my little guy, he had complex needs, right? And I wasn't just going to leave him with anyone, especially later on, he got a feeding tube. And so someone had to be trained. But even before that, because I worked full time, I needed daycare. And that was almost impossible to find. In fact, the only daycare center that I could find was 45 minutes from my home. So, and I know that right now, I've heard from a lot of caregivers that daycare is definitely an issue and becoming an even bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points to bring up. And I think you guys did a really amazing job of kind of just summarizing the common struggles that kinship caregivers face in their role. And so I really appreciate you kind of speaking to the breadth and the width of how much you're dealing with. It's really important that that be aired out. And so I appreciate you guys speaking to that. The next question is, so kind of moving away from the challenges, we've talked a lot about the challenges of being a kinship caregiver, but what are the real benefits of children going to a kin or a fictive kin caregiver? And for anyone in the room who may not know what the difference is between a fictive kin or an actual kinship caregiver, I'm happy to explain that as well. But who wants to start with that question?
Me, I will.
Okay.
There you go, Robin.
Robin, and then Rosalind, and then Jeannie. We'll go that way.
Okay, so we know that if children are placed with kin or fictive kin, we know that they do better with stability. I'm sorry, guys, I've got a dog, a very big dog, but we know that they don't have as many struggles with stability. They keep their connections with their siblings and their close family members. They keep their connections with their tribes or their communities, their culture. We know that they have better outcomes as far as schooling. There's a whole bunch of good other stuff. What am I forgetting, y'all?
I would add on, they don't age out of a family, right? They're part of the family. They can still have a relationship with their birth parents when that's, appropriate, because, it's not just like this little box and this is how the family is. It's a broader thing than that. They're part of the broader community, and they have a better sense of who they are and where they come from, because they're able to continue to stay in that broader community.
So I also think about when we talk about the benefits of children, and we hear people say the research. Well, in Washington, we have, there's this survey that all the teenagers do in school, and it's called the Healthy Youth Survey. And I think maybe six years ago or so, we were able to work with the folks that make the survey and add questions about living arrangements, which then allowed us to be able to sort data by kids who are in kinship care and foster care. And so we were able to see real data on our own kids and the differences that it made for the kids in Washington living with kinship caregivers versus living in foster care. And what we know is that kids in Washington, they have higher level of school success when they're with kinship caregivers, lower attempts of suicide, and lower rates of tobacco use, alcohol use, and drug use. And that was from the kids reporting. And then from our own internal tracking, we know that we have an increased rate with siblings, higher levels of permanency, because caregivers, they don't give up on their families so easy, and greater preservation of culture and the community, which are all so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the digression into that little vein of thought here, we have some questions in the chat that are kind of relevant to this area of the discussion. So I wanted to bring them in case anyone could speak to those. Jeannie, you mentioned kind of the cultural aspect of this. Someone is wondering, if no one else speaks the child's language, but you speak their language, is that a consideration of fictive kin? And another person is wondering, can you speak on to when a kin or a relative is taken into another state, and what are the resources for them?
So I can tackle the one about going into another state. So there are ICPC agreements that are in place, Interstate Compact PC, something placement of children. Sorry, we just call it ICPC.
Yeah.
And that means that a kid is from Washington going to California. And so the child will stay in Washington, and eventually once the background checks are done and the home maybe becomes licensed, all of this stuff, and the child goes there, it just depends upon the home state, not the home state, but the state that they're going to, about the resources that would be available for them. And it depends on if later on there's an adoption or if there's a guardianship. It just really depends upon what the permanency outcome is. But one of the things that does follow the child is their Medicaid services should follow the child. Yeah, that's it.
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right.
Thank
Robin.
you, Jessica. Interstate Compact on Placement of Children.
There we go. ICPC. We got it now. So kind of moving from that, so with all of that in mind, you all brought up really amazing points in terms of, the connection of these families to resources and that ability to access those. So with all of what you have brought up in mind, what do you believe systems should be doing to provide more support for the children and their respective caregivers? We'll start with Rosalind and then Robin and Jeannie.
Well, considering that I work primarily with those outside the formal system, there's a huge disparity in resources that are available to those folks. And I would say to continue to support nationally and at each state level and local level resources to those kinship caregivers that are outside the system, as well as supporting those, of course, that are involved with the formal system. There's just this huge disparity. So it's a prevention mode when you think about it. We're helping to keep those families strong so that they don't have to go into the formal system. So it makes more sense to put money in that direction.
I agree with Rosalind. I want to say that it's important for advocacy efforts are important. So because people don't understand what people go through to try to keep children in their communities and in their families. And I think that it is really important to give, because we know how to take the best care of our own communities, right? Of our own people. If you have a question about my son, I'm probably the best person to ask whether he's going to work this case plan or whether he needs, this or that. And so keeping communities strong is a really big way of preventing removals and the harm that brings. And it's not just, if you remove a child from their family or from their community, that has long-lasting effects, not just for the year or two that you're involved in the case. It's long-lasting generational effects. So more support for communities so that we can take care of our own.
So we know that the benefits of kinship care are clear. However, there are still so many barriers in place that keep relatives from accessing support that they're not able to, right? And so from the complicated licensure process or the inequality of the financial support, we're looking at all these barriers, and we're not perfect. The system is far from perfect. But because of all of the bipartisan support that we have in our state, we are able to actually make some inroads lately. And so top leadership has made it the department's priority to create a kin first culture. And so, and I know I'm not saying anything that anybody doesn't already know, but sometimes there are staff biases. Biases like, oh, it's family, you should just be taking care of them. Why do you need support? It's just family. And so we're working hard on trainings and different projects to try to reduce the bias in the staff. We're also, as I talked about earlier, the kinship license, the initial license, additional supports. So there are these folks that support caregivers. So additional staff that are unique to the caregivers, so they have somebody to touch base with when they have simple questions like, where's my mileage check, or when is the next court date, or what does this mean? So we're creating point people at each region. And then expanding subsidies. Recently, we just expanded our guardianship subsidies. And so there's pretty much, the only reason you wouldn't get a subsidy is if you didn't go guardianship or you didn't become licensed. But these are just like little bitty things, and we are continuing to work on this stuff and ask questions and develop new programs. So it's going to be exciting in Washington to see what happens next.
Really great discussion on the differences between state systems generally, right? We have a lot of differences between Washington State and Oklahoma, where you're based, Robin. And so I think this is a really vital conversation to understanding just how different these laws and these restrictions and these benefits can look across different states. So going from there, what roles do kinship caregivers play in supporting reunification? And does that look different from the role of a non-native caregiver? We'll start with a non-native or a non-relative caregiver. And so I can start with Rosalind again, I guess. You just spoke. So we'll start with you, and then Jeannie and Robin again. And I am keeping tabs on the questions, and we will try to get to as many of those at the end as well.
Yeah, that's great. So Jeannie and I have been working on a research project in Washington State for a number of years now, collaboratively with the University of Washington. And one of the pieces that we've been looking at is what happens to the kiddos when they may leave the kinship caregiver home. And one of the things that we've found over this duration of the research project is the majority of the children that leave the kinship caregiver home for some reason are reunifying with their birth parents. And so that's really encouraging to see that outcome, because we know that they're making a difference because we're seeing it. We've heard through having conversations for many, many years with kinship caregivers that they have an ongoing relationship with their children when they can. And so it's encouraging to see it in paper or in the research that that's really the case, that people are really reunifying, and so they have those ongoing relationships, and they will continue to have a relationship most times with the children once they're reunified as well. So that's that community again, as I was talking about earlier. You're not just taking them from one house to another house and saying goodbye. They're going to be staying part of the family unit on an ongoing basis. So that's exciting to see that we can really track that now.
So for the formal system, one of the questions that we ask the kinship caregivers before we place a child with them is, are you willing to support the reunification plan? And so that's out there up front in the focus, that it's not our intent to make this forever. We're still working with parents, trying to help them remedy their parenting deficiencies. And so this may not be forever. But the bottom line is kinship caregivers, the family is forever. So they're always going to be family. And so just because once DCYF steps out of their lives doesn't mean that the family dissolves. It just means the family is still there working together, trying to support caregivers and the parents. And so that does look a little, there are traditional foster parents that create relationships with our parents and the children after DCYF has stepped out of the lives, but it's different with family. Family, like I said, family's forever. They don't ever go away.
Well, I can say that when I took placement of my little guy, I was thinking, okay, they're going to figure out who did this, and mommy and daddy are going to work a plan, and he's going to go right back, right? Well, he's 9.5 now, and mommy and daddy did work their plan, but I co-parent now with my little guy's mama because my son passed away. So it's my job, and I know that his mama sees this as well. We don't always get along. I mean, we agree to disagree, but it is my job to make sure that he can look up in the football stands when he has a game, and he knows that there's a lot of people, and every one of us loves him, right? So he rolls with 10 or 12 people. We're all family. Her side of the family and my side of the family, we just make sure that he knows that he's loved. And I think that was one of the hardest things is to learn for both of us. It was to co-parent him. So he goes back and forth between us during the week. I have him all, on the weekends for sure. And several days through the week, I pick him up from school. I take him to football practice. And she's working full time. She's a young mama. She has another child. She's trying to get herself together. I want him to have the best future that he can have. And that means making sure that we have a strong family for him. So that's why most kinship caregivers do what they do, is because we love them. And no matter what happens, we're still going to love them. And like Jeannie said, family is forever. And so, and also, if you're a caseworker and you're going into this, most of us we didn't want to bring children up again. I had just finished, my youngest child was 20. I was done. I was taking naps whenever I wanted to. So I was going to do whatever I could to help with reunification. But my goal was also to make sure that he went somewhere that was safe, and that his mommy and daddy were able to take good care of him when he did finally reunify. So we co-parent, and it's working so far for us.
Really amazing dialogues between everyone here, and I think it's really critical just in terms of that lived experience, right? I mean, you all come with your own ideals of your lived experience of how you approach these issues, and so it's a really great segue again into our next question, which is specific to each one of your specific roles. So in each one of your roles, how do you actually help kinship providers navigate all of this? I'm just in hearing each one of you talk and throughout this webinar, I think my main takeaway obviously is just how much there is to navigate, right? And so I was wondering if you could each speak to, it's amazing that we have folks that are involved in the state, the formal system and the informal system, and then folks with lived experience who can kind of answer this question in their own way. And so I was wondering, in terms of how you help other kinship providers or kinship caregivers navigate all this, what does that look like for you? I'll start with Robin, since you just had a really wonderful dialogue about your lived experience, and then we'll go to Jeannie and Rosalind.
Sure. So I guess when my little guy was maybe about 3, I found Generations United, Grand Voices initiative. And while I was comfortable speaking with my tribal legislators and our chief of our tribe about things that we need as kinship caregivers, I didn't know how to advocate with other policy leaders and other people who could make changes. So joining Grand Voices as an advocate began my journey with helping others, and also connecting with others who are kinship caregivers. And at this time, I am on staff of Generations United. We have, I think, 85 Grand Voices in 46 states and 12 tribes right now who are out advocating for just the sorts of things that we've spoken about today. We also at Generations United and we have a new network in the I can't remember the exact name. Melissa Devlin's on. I know that she'll put it in the chat for us, but I call it the network. But we produce tools and just fact sheets, all kinds of things that kinship caregivers and those who work with them can access so that you can have up-to-date information and facts and data and things like that. So that's really helpful. But I think my favorite part about, thanks, Melissa. I think my favorite part about being a Grand Voice and working with Generations United is we have peer-to-peer calls where all these Grand Voices from around the country get together and we say, okay, I'm having this problem. Like last month, it was, I'm having a problem with my state won't do a proclamation for Kinship Month. And so there's all these different voices of different experiences so we can get together and help each other. And that's been really, really important to me and so helpful to me personally. So hopongU.org, and Melissa will throw the link to our network in the chat, I'm sure too. Lots of information.
So my role in my day-to-day job is policy writing, bill analysis, procedures. It's pretty dry. But one of my roles is to facilitate the Kinship Caregiver Oversight Committee meeting that happens once a month. And when the KCOC was formed back in 2004, it's formed by our legislature. And the purpose of the KCOC is to kind of guide and steer the department's policies and processes. And so my role in my day-to-day job is to elevate the voices that I hear from the kinship caregivers when we are working on policy and processes, and to say, hey, but what about this? And so that's my job. You know, I recognize that the system is just so complex, and we are working so hard to try to make it easier to navigate. The other thing that we're doing to help providers is we looked at our own house. And so many state agencies, all of a sudden you look around and you realize you're siloed and people are like not talking to each other. And so we have child welfare and we're the boots on the grounds working with the families. And then there's the licensing division who does the licensing of our initial licenses, the kinship licenses and regular foster licenses. And we now team. And so there's two of us that are in constant communications with each other. And we make sure that the one side of the house knows what the other side of the house is doing when it comes to caregiving. That way we're not duplicating efforts and we're actually coordinating so services go a lot smoother. And so that's some of the things that I'm doing. Roz?
So in my role, I do a lot of things as Jeannie does, administrative things, putting together legislative asks, helping to do a lot of advocacy in the community, but I also oversee the Kinship Navigator program statewide. So we partner with the area agencies on aging, which house the Kinship Navigator programs at each location, and or they subcontract with other nonprofit agencies in their communities to do the direct work. So we do a lot of staff trainings, we do a lot of supports of Kinship Navigators. We also do brainstorming. You know, if someone has a family that they're working with and they're kind of stuck and they don't know what to do, or they need to make a connection up the ladder somewhere, you know, we help to support them around those kinds of concerns. And then I also get constituent or kinship caregivers contacting me directly about needs and resources that they need, or other things that they have concerns about. So when I'm working with the kinship caregivers, you know, oftentimes what I'm doing is, of course, listening, but also asking some specific questions, trying to dig deeper into what is the need at hand, and then what might be the next need, you know, after that one is being met, so that we can kind of steer them in the right direction. And of course, connecting them with kinship navigators and other resources within their specific community. So I do a lot of that. We also have kinship support program funds called Kinship Caregiver Support Program Funds that are available for families that are eligible to help with basic need kinds of things on an occasional basis. For example, if they needed beds, that might help with those kinds of things. And those are also available through the area agencies on aging, but I oversee that part of the program as well. So we can help coordinate a lot of resources for those outside the formal system that they might have needs for in that regard.
Thank you all so much for giving out such amazing resources and places that people can go to start figuring out things, especially in Washington State. I'm really grateful we have two folks coming from Washington State because like Robin mentioned earlier, it really is ahead of the curve on a lot of legislative things as it relates to not just kinship care, but foster care and kinship placements and things like that overall. So I'm really grateful to have all of your, breadth of experience and perspective here today, which leads into another type of broad question, but I think it's something that each one of you, I think, is uniquely positioned to answer in your own way. So September, I don't need to tell any of you this, September is National Kinship Care Month. So what would be your message to folks who are currently parenting their kin or maybe thinking about it? What would you say to them? I'll start with Rosalind and then Jeannie and Robin.
I would strongly urge you to get connected with resources and supports. You are not alone. Robin, you talked about Generations United. That's a fabulous place to start because it's, national and lots of wonderful resources. I've participated in several of their conferences and really there's so much opportunities there. So you're not alone.
What I would say is, while September is Kinship Caregiver Month, their work is never ended. It's tireless. Don't give up is what I tell people. Don't give up. Yes, it's hard. They're the unsung heroes of the child welfare system. Over half, we're almost to 60% of our placements right now when kids are out of home are with kinship caregivers, which is remarkable because as a state, we were only like at about 35% just 4 or 5 years ago. And what we know is that we recognize the hard work that you're doing. We see you, and we really embrace, as an agency, we hear the kinship. So our KCOC group, they have a motto: nothing for us without us. And we try to embrace that when we are developing new policies and processes and programs. And so don't give up and know we are listening.
Thank you for that, Jeannie. I just want to say that it is hard. And I've spent, especially the first 5 years, just exhausted, but it's so worth it. I mean, I just think about my own little guy, and he was, just about everything you can fracture on a 4-month-old was fractured. And now he plays football, and I watch him sleep, and he is my greatest joy. While he's ornery and he's a boy, but it's so worth it. And to Rosalind's point, you're not alone. I mean, I know it seems like that, but just reach out. I mean, you can contact me anytime, rwind@gu.org, and I'll be happy to either help you connect with resources or just talk to you myself. So just keep going. It's worth it.
Such powerful messages of encouragement and compassion and strength. I think it's really necessary because you're right. I mean, they are definitely the unsung heroes. There are so much really weighing on these folks to keep these families together. And so it is it's a burden, but it's also a blessing, as Robin has done such a beautiful job to illustrate. So with that, I'm going to open it up to our last question of the day before we open it up to the chat room questions. But given that I've seen a lot in the chat about, different things related to linguistic differences for relatives. I mentioned someone mentioned the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a 1978 federal law that regulates states' who are having Indigenous children in their court system and in their child welfare proceedings. It's supposed to regulate state courts for those proceedings. So I'm hearing a lot of kind of different communities in this room and folks from different groups of people. And so I was just wondering if each of you could speak a little bit more to just generally, in your opinion, why is kinship care important for all communities, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your political affiliation? If you're like me, myself, or Robin here, who are enrolled members of tribes, how does kinship care provide and preserve cultural, linguistic, and language ties in a community or a family, given that it is something that obviously plays out differently depending on what community you're dealing with, and there are certain needs that each community needs to that are faced with each community. And so I was wondering if each one of you could speak a little bit more to that. We'll start with Jeannie and then go to Rosalind and Robin.
So what I think is raising healthy, happy children takes effort, and lots of people are involved in that. There's that saying, it takes a village, and it does. It takes the support of community, friends, family. Even in my own life, we rely heavily on aunts and uncles and grandparents to help guide and mold kids. And it should be no different for a child who is in the care and custody of the state or even the tribe. We still want that support because we know the benefits. We know that. And so, yeah, I'm going to pass it on to the next person.
So kinship care isn't a new concept, for heaven's sakes. It's been going on since families have been in existence, right? That's just what families do. They step up when someone isn't able to, or they have a broader approach of what family is in the first place. So everybody's raising everybody, and everybody's accountable to everybody. That's and then you have all our political structures that are trying to put everybody in a neat little box. Well, it isn't that. That's not the way families are, right? We're not nice, tidy little. So we need to think broader, be more creative, be more open to opportunities to help communities support the families within their own communities the way they want to support them. We need to build infrastructures that are able to be open and more open-minded and more nimble to help support families to build a stronger community. I think, Robin, you were talking earlier about, you want to build a strong community. Well, we have to be able to have some sort of systems that can help to do that aren't so siloed. So that's my little soapbox.
On a personal level, I think my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my ancestors didn't walk all the way to Oklahoma so that I could let my child or my children go and be adopted out of my community or placed somewhere else because I want to take a nap instead of raising a child after I was done raising children, right? So for me, it is important to keep our children within our community so that, because they're our future leaders. They are our future ceremony. They hold our ceremonies for us. They're going to be learning our languages. It's just the future of us, especially for federally recognized tribes. There's certain things we have to have in, to remain federally recognized tribes, and those children in our communities are a big part of that. So that's why it's important to me, is because I wanted to make sure that the sacrifices of my people were not in vain. So
Thank you, everyone, for bringing in your valued perspective, and Robin, obviously, for that historical component. I think it is really important when we talk about kinship and generational trauma of families as it relates to kinship care to acknowledge those things. So I think I really appreciate you airing that out for us today. So I think we're going to move on to some questions that I've been gathering from the chat. Thank you for all the folks who have been chiming in. I've been trying my best to keep in touch with that, but if you have further questions, now is the time to enter those into the chat room here. I'm going to start with a question that's specific to our Washington State folks. Someone was asking about an earlier point of conversation that we were having earlier for you, Jeannie and Rosalind. So are you stating that Washington kinship or / fictive kin caregivers don't need to be fully licensed?
So it is a fully licensed. So kinship caregivers are fully licensed. There are just different waivers that are available to different folks. And then yesterday, the federal government announced that you can now have 2 tracks. So we're taking a look at that. And so I suspect we're going to have some even more changes coming down the pipeline for Washington. But a kinship license, and I want to be really clear with this, is a full license. Let me explain the difference. So a while back, we passed this Senate Bill 5151, which created what we actually call a child-specific license. And so a caregiver can get licensed for a specific child, their niece, their nephew, their grandchild, instead of just going into the general pool of foster parents. And they take on any kid, like they get the call at 2 a.m. Hey, we got a kid in, can you take this child? They don't want to. They only want to take their niece or their nephew. And so we created a child-specific license. We renamed the child-specific license the kinship license.
Rosalind, do you have anything to add to that, or is it okay if I move on to the next question?
You can move on.
This is a much more broad question, I think, that all of you are positioned to answer. So I'll open it up to all of you here. But one person is asking if we could speak to setting boundaries and maintaining relationships with biological parents. Robin, I'll start with you since you have the lived experience, and maybe you could speak to something more specific, and then I'll open it up to Jeannie and Rosalind.
Sure. So for me, it was not hard to set a boundary, set boundaries, because my son was grown, and now this baby needs me to make sure that he has everything that he needs so that he can grow up healthy and strong. So, but I do recognize that with some families there are issues with setting boundaries. So what worked for my family may not work for other people's family, but that is just for me personally what I had to do because and they always made fun of me because with my boys I was like, oh, you're not bleeding, you're fine, but with my little guy I basically bubble wrapped him and everything else in the house just in case, right? So it's true that you treat grandchildren different than you do personal children. I can attest to that, and so can my boys.
I don't have anything to add.
Right, Rosalind, do you have anything to add there?
Can you ask the question one more time, please?
Yeah, of course. So one person in the chat asked if we could speak to setting boundaries and maintaining relationships with biological parents.
Gotcha. So oftentimes when I was a kinship navigator, we'd have conversations around those types of things because sometimes it's a case-by-case situation. It's truly a case-by-case situation. And so I would just refer people to counseling or support groups or both, to help them through the challenges of, enforcing those boundaries. You might set those boundaries or try to set those boundaries. And then it's like, okay, I need some help. I need someone to refer to as I'm trying to enforce that. So I would just find resources and supports to help you with those things.
Absolutely. Thank you all for speaking to that very important and nuanced question. Um, this is my, I think the last question, unless we start having more come into the chat, but one thing that I saw that we may want to touch on is someone else in the chat asked, what happens if the majority of KINs can't be licensed? Or when they have historical ASFA disqualifiers or their home has significant licensing violations? What are the next steps for those families? I'll start with Jeannie and then Rosalind and Robin.
So in our state, we have what we call the background unit, and they're the ones who do all of our background checks, and we don't actually, the caseworkers never see what the background is. Well, there's a lot of reasons for it, but the background check unit, their goal is to get to yes with any kinship caregiver. That's the goal. And while occasionally we say no, we can't license you, we can't pass your home, it's so minimal. Like, it's less than 5%. I mean, it's so tiny. So it's not really something that comes up a lot for us. But when it does, there are federal and state laws that we have to abide by, and there's really not an option. And so what we do is then we have this other amazing unit called the relative search unit, and their job is to go find relatives for us. And so if one relative can't pass, we're looking for the next person, or the next, we call them suitable other persons. Normal people refer to them as friends, teachers, coaches, godparents. And so we just keep looking, because so recently the state legislature reaffirmed to us that placing a child with a kinship caregiver is our #1 priority.
I don't really have anything to add on to the formal part of things, but I would make one little comment in that sometimes we have caregivers that are that come to us that want to get licensed as a foster parent for the child in their care. And we need to explain to them that they can't become a licensed foster parent for the child in their care if the child isn't involved with the formal system. If there's not an open dependency, they can't be a licensed foster provider for that child. So just learning all of those steps is really important, because oftentimes there are resources that are only for this population, or they have to meet this criteria in order to be eligible for a resource. So and the caregivers don't know what all the terminology is, so they're just using terminology that sounds, they might say, for example, I'm a foster care, they're my foster grandchild. And so then I have to dig deeper and go, do you have a foster care license? And they will go, well, no, I'm just raising them. So we just need to help instill the correct terminology so that they're able to communicate their circumstances correctly to those that are involved with the systems that they work with. So that's all I had to add to that.
Well, what I'll add is what I'm so happy with what Jeannie mentioned about people trying to rule people in, because when I first started licensing foster parents back in the day, if your uncle acted up in college and got a public intox charge, you were ruled out and you can forget it. But now I understand that a lot of states, tribes, and jurisdictions are doing their best to rule people in, because it is, better for the children to be with their family members. So I think a lot of jurisdictions are working to, as long as like Jeannie said, it's not something that runs afoul of the Adam Walsh Act or whatever state regulations or tribal regulations are in place, that people are trying to be ruled in. And oftentimes, also when I first started, back in my day, cousins slept wherever. It might have been on a couch or a pallet on the floor. That was not appropriate. But with new possible licensing standards for kin, if it's not something that's safety related, then I see a lot more of these families being able to go ahead and be licensed. And that can only be helpful for everyone.
It's a great place to, I think, end the dialogue for today. I'm going to have to wrap it up and we can start giving out the end of webinar resources that we have for everyone today. In terms of what we have for those leaving the webinar today, we wanted to leave you guys with a list of resources that may help along your journey to gather more information and research on this very important topic. So at the top, that link that says Fostering Families Today, that is our wonderful resource list that actually has a lot of really amazing stuff. I would highly recommend that all of you guys check that out first and foremost. Everything else on this slide and the next slide are predominantly from the Child Welfare Information Gateway, which is a wonderful resource covering all different types of child welfare topics. And given that this month is National Kinship Care Month, the Child Welfare Information Gateway did have a compilation of parenting resources for kinship caregivers this month. We also have for you resources for kinship caregivers who may be dealing with a runaway youth or a youth that is experiencing homelessness. And then I would encourage anyone who's interested in podcasts, if anyone in the room is a very big podcast lover like myself, you can check out this 5-part podcast series called Advances in Supporting Kinship Caregivers. We've linked to the part 1 and part 2 episodes for you. And then on the next slide, we have resources specific to Spanish language caregivers. So this is happening in conjunction with our exciting news here at Fostering Families Today, which is that Fostering Families Today, our magazine, is going to be starting a Spanish language issue starting in the next issue, which is the November-December issue. So if you're interested in subscribing to that Spanish language version, contact the Business Development Manager, Deborah Denzel, at that email address that you see there. I'm sure someone can add it to the chat if that's needed for anyone. And so this list of resources here is specific to Spanish families and families in the Spanish community who may be dealing with, for example, an immigrant family or a refugee family or someone seeking asylum. And then we also have resources for family engagement and improving child welfare outcomes, and as well as just kind of knowing the costs and resources of planning for adoption if you're a kinship caregiver that is looking for that in your future planning. And so with that, I think that concludes our time today. If anyone wants to, once again, follow us here at Fostering Families Today, Youth Voices Rising, or, the organization that I work under, the Imprint, more than welcome to follow all of those wonderful social media platforms there. And our wonderful behind the scenes director, Kim Hansel, has put the contact information for our business admin person in the chat for those who want to have access to that Spanish language edition of our Fostering Families magazine. And then I'm just going to say once again, thank you all so much to the panelists, our esteemed guests, and for everyone who joined today. Please feel free to send any comments, questions, ideas, tips for our organizations. We want to feature your family, so please reach out to info@fosteringmediaconnections.org if you are interested in reaching out. And once again, thank you to everyone today. Thanks to our team who put this all together, and thank you to our, once again, esteemed panelists and guests. I really appreciate all of the wonderful insights you guys brought today on a very critical issue in our child welfare landscape. So thank you all so much.